Welcome back, Canonites. When I released my Origins of the Weapon video last week, several people wanted a dedicated follow-up that would dive into the parallels between the creation of the weapon as a means to defeat Cortana, and how it mirrors the tale of mendicant bias and offensive bias during the Forerunner Flood War. While we have talked about this in places before, it never hurts to dedicate an entire video to the subject, especially if your base is asking for it. So today, let's dive in and explore this topic in full. And also, maybe at the end we'll do some crazy theory crafting. To start on this journey, to understand how history has repeated itself, it's first important to understand the original context, mendicant bias and offensive bias in this case. Some of this may be old hat to some people, but I hope you'll stick with it as I'm going to try and change up the presentation format. Anyway though, on to the lore. Following a war between ancient spacefaring humanity and the Forerunners, during which the Flood first came to be known, the Forerunners began to prepare for the parasite's imminent return. Part of that strategy was the creation of mendicant bias, the most powerful ancilla, the Forerunner term for an AI, ever created. Known as a contender-class ancilla, an even more powerful form of the already astonishingly powerful Medarch-class ancilla, Mendicant would be tasked with overseeing Forerunner defenses when the Flood returned to the Milky Way. Right away, we can identify a few parallels to Cortana. Cortana was created for Operation Red Flag, an effort to end the Human Covenant War by kidnapping one of their leaders and forcing peace negotiations. I've gone over why this would never work, but let's not focus on that for the time being. The important part here is Cortana and Mendicant being created for what might have been the key military actions of their respective eras. Further, at the time of her creation, and arguably to this day, Cortana was the most advanced AI the UNSC had ever produced, not unlike mendicant bias for the Forerunners. There are also implications that Mendicant was created using the composed minds of ancient human commanders. While UNSC Smart AI are created using brain scans of real people, Cortana was unique in that the brain used to create her was a cloned version of Dr. Catherine Halsey's, the greatest scientist in the UNSC. In short, both AI had unique circumstances surrounding their creation. More than 250 years after the Flood reappeared in the galaxy, Mendicant was tasked with studying a being known as the Primordial, later identified as a gravemind for the Flood. Over their 43-year conversation, Mendicant came to agree with the Primordial's, and thus the Flood's, way of thinking, forcing itself into rampancy and deciding to help the Flood. This was thanks to what later became known as the Logic Plague. For those unaware, the Logic Plague was essentially a philosophical corruption, another way of the Flood to infect and spread itself. The Logic Plague is not static or rigid, but rather it is adaptable to any situation, taking the form of arguments and facts carefully calculated to direct a being's way of thinking to align with the Flood's. In this way, it is not a mere computer virus, but can also infect organic minds. The Ur-Didact, or simply the Didact, the main antagonist of Halo 4, is probably the second best known victim of the plague, right after mendicant bias. Back on topic, Cortana herself would spend more than a month with the Gravemind from November 3rd to December 11th, 2552. It's been a point of debate whether Cortana was actually infected with the Logic Plague during this time, though the short story Human Weakness from the anthology Halo Evolutions certainly makes it seem like the Gravemind was trying. It's certainly a path 343 have available to them, though I personally don't think she was infected. For now, we're just focusing on the fact they had conversations. So, after Cortana was rescued by Spartan 117, she would have to endure 4.5 years of isolation as the rear section of the UNSC Forward Unto Dawn drifted through space, awaiting any rescue from the UNSC. That period of time would, of course, lead to her rampancy, and that rampancy would eventually result in the Empress Cortana we meet in Halo 5. So, the parallels here are a bit less direct, but we can see these advanced AI being driven into rampancy and turning on their creators for what they believe to be a greater good. And it's here that we enter both the weapon and offensive bias in their respective stories. In the time of the Forerunners, after mendicant bias had turned on them, a new contender was created, offensive bias. While we have very little information on offensive bias, we do know that this second contender was more restricted compared to mendicant, less creative and independent, a measure against the Logic Plague. In the final battle of the Forerunner Flood War, offensive bias would deploy against Mendicant in a fleet battle to keep the Flood from reaching the Ark. In a battle where offensive bias was outnumbered 436.6 to 1, it was ultimately able to take advantage of Mendican's rampant state, its anger and tendencies towards mistakes, combined with its own offensive lethality to defeat the original contender. At the conclusion of their battle, Mendican's core would be carved out and delivered to the Ark, where it would be entombed for all time. In 2560, we have the Weapon, an AI created under similar circumstances to Cortana, though one that has some notable differences from her older sister beyond just visually. Smart AIs are essentially born, so to speak, with fully developed personalities, at least as far as the human experience is concerned. Relatively speaking, AI birth is a long process for them as they choose their name and appearance, but I digress. However, from the recent footage, we can see that the Weapon seems to be more, for lack of a better word, restricted in some ways, and even a little naive. For example, when she's pondering the fact that she's still around, even though Cortana has reportedly been deleted, she seems relaxed for a brief moment while contemplating this, before snapping to attention when the chief turns to look at her. And there's the notable moment when she's confused over the notion of changing mission priorities. Both are behaviors odd for a smart AI. Smart AI will snap to attention when given direct orders or question things in a human manner, but those are distinctly different behaviors than what we see happening with the Weapon. The Weapon very much seems to be a more restricted AI, even coming with an instant termination program for when her task was completed. This mirrors Offensive Bias in many ways, and though we ultimately don't know what happened to Offensive after it delivered Mendicant Bias to the Ark, its final actions too mirror what the Weapon was created to do. The Weapon was meant to lure Cortana to a Forerunner installation, what could be but remains unconfirmed to be Installation 07, where she'd lock down the rogue Cortana for retrieval. This isn't too dissimilar in function at least from Offensive Bias holding Mendicant at the Maginot Line, then carving out its personality matrix to be delivered to the Ark. Laying everything out, we can see clear parallels between Cortana and the Weapon, and Mendicant Bias and Offensive Bias. Which makes one wonder, how will it all end? In the library edition of Halo Escalation, an edition that includes commentary alongside the original comics, we were told by then narrative lead Brian Reed, quote, "Roland gets his name from the same source as Cortana. Go look up the Song of Roland for an education in French mythology, or because you think it might be full of clues for Halo 6. Both are good reasons." This is something we have discussed before, but bears re-examination in light of the new campaign footage. To sum things up, the Song of Roland is about the death of the Paladin Roland, nephew of King Charlemagne, during the campaign against the Muslims of Spain. In the story, a peace is attempted between the Muslim king Marsil and Charlemagne. After receiving Marsil's offer, Charlemagne needs a messenger to go to Marsil's court and formally accept it. Roland suggests his stepfather Ganelon. Believing that Roland expects him to be killed by the enemy, Ganelon betrays Roland and informs the Muslim forces of how to ambush Roland's party. Roland is then ambushed and killed in battle. Before he dies, however, he blows his horn Oliphant until his temples burst, summoning revenge. In the end, Charlemagne's forces avenge Roland, and Ganelon is killed for treason in a very gruesome manner. In the years since, there have been several attempts to line up the events of the song with the story of Halo, and there are many ways to go about that, from the very literal to the more mundane. The AI Roland, introduced in Halo 4 Spartan Ops, is the most obvious reference to the epic poem, though whether he'll play a role similar to the historic Roland remains to be seen. Cortana's name is another reference, an alternate spelling for the name of a legendary short sword, Cortan, wielded by Ogier the Dane, another of Charlemagne's paladins. The sword was said to contain the inscription, "My name is Cortana, of the same steel and temper as Joyous and Durandal." Durandal was the sword wielded by Roland, and Joyous was Charlemagne's. So, what does that all mean? Well, I think the obvious takeaway here pertains to the new AI. Currently, she is referred to only as the Weapon, likely a way to prevent the Chief from forming any personal attachment, but also to build a little mystery for the audience. I think her name will be revealed as Joyous, or Joyous, the Weapon of Charlemagne, with the Chief taking a parallel role to Charlemagne in the Song of Roland. There are deeper parallels there too, such as the Banished filling in for the Spanish Saracens and implications at the Fate of Infinity, but I'll flesh that out in another video, where we can dedicate more time to the epic poem itself. For today, the most important parallel is Cortana and its sister swords. So, we have Cortana, and we might have Joyous, but where does that leave Durandal? To properly discuss this, we need to dive into some Bungie history, briefly. Before Halo, Bungie's big sci-fi series was another series with a green-suited cyborg going around killing aliens. A lot of ideas and terminology familiar to Halo fans stems from the Marathon series, but the important information for today surrounds an AI at the core of the series, Durandal. We already know where the Durandal name comes from, and when creating Halo, the team decided to use the name Cortana for their new AI character. Incidentally, this led many to believe there might be a Joyous AI in Destiny, but that's neither here nor there. Even with the franchise out of Bungie's hands, we can still see the influences the Song of Roland continues to have, with the song even being directly referenced in 2016's comic, Dominion Splinter. According to legend, Durandal was Charlemagne's sword for a brief time, before it eventually passed to Roland, a loose parallel to Cortana originally being the Chief's AI, if we stick with the idea of the Chief playing the part of Charlemagne. I think the Durandal name could still be used. Last week during the E3 hype, a crazy idea entered my mind. There's been a common theory among the fanbase about this replacement Cortana being used to cure Cortana of her madness. Now, while I personally find that abhorrent and would hate to see anything that risks undermining Halo 4's ending entirely, and certainly don't want to see a return to the old status quo just for the sake of nostalgia because that's absolutely what it would be, I think a version of this idea could work. What if the weapon, aka Joyous, merges with Empress Cortana, creating a new AI who takes the name Durandal? It's a crazy idea, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. It would help to wrap up the created storyline and provide a hell of a twist for the audience, never mind what it could potentially do for the story going forward. Durandal could theoretically represent the birth of an AI without a risk of rampancy, depending on how things play out, and could start the path to rebuilding relationships between humanity and AIs. If this does happen though, I would only hope that this new AI's personality is incredibly distinct from both the weapon and Cortana's, with a look all her own. Again, I dread a return to the old status quo. If I had my way, I'd want something like a punk rock or cyberpunk style Cortana with an attitude to match. Snarky, but turned up to 11. Those are just my crazy thoughts on the matter though. The weapon is a character rife with possibility both in terms of her historical parallels and what she could mean for the story going forward. Let me know your thoughts on any of this in the comments below. Thanks for watching as always, stick around for the Patreon shoutout, and until next time, this has been Halo Canon. First, I'd like to give a big thank you to our Horospis patrons. First, there's Hope, then we have Freight, followed by SS Diko-chan, Justin Montgomery, and finally, Discombobulated Sycophant. Thank you all for your amazing support of the channel. Next, I'd like to thank our theoretical patrons. If you'd like to see your name here or get a direct shoutout, check out patreon.com/HaloCanon. You can simply support the channel or get additional benefits, such as behind-the-scenes material, including the raw audio for upcoming videos, and even shoutouts like this. All patrons now get early access to certain videos as well, and more benefits are to come. However, your continued viewership is more than enough for me. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and maybe even subscribing to the channel if you aren't already. If you really enjoy this, turn on that notification bell so you can be among the first to see new videos when they release. But for all my fellow Canonites, keep on being awesome.